Welcome back to Open Line. We're going back in history here, talking about an old murder in Nashville, 1964 murder of Paula Herring. She was a babysitter. New book is out, A Murder in Music City. It's written by Michael Bishop, who spent really decades looking into this murder and believes it's part of, the wrong person was convicted. There was a political cover-up. The foreword in the book is written by someone you took this to, and I want all your theory too.
Sure.
He says in there, there's a special place in hell for people who misuse their power and convict the wrong people.
Right.
And it's very powerful what he says. But so who did you take this theory, this new theory that you had to?
So two things happened not too far into the research that I was doing. Once I realized that there had been no actual autopsy of the victim, I ended up hooking up with the Henry Lee Institute. That's the famous Henry Lee forensic doctor who was part of the O.J. Simpson case, part of the John Benet Ramsey case. He's been all over. So I took the file that I had from Chief Kemp and I went to Yale, New Haven, Connecticut, and I asked them to provide for me a photographic autopsy based on the wounds. So they did that. They confirmed a lot of the things that I thought might have taken place. But when I started then looking at who the suspects were in the case, I was just lost. I was stumped on where to go from here. So in 2010, there was a book that was released called The Murder Room. And it's a story about the best investigators, detectives in the world who meet once a month in Philadelphia. They work on cold cases from all over the country, primarily the United States. One of the men who founded that was named Richard Walter. Richard Walter is a forensic psychologist. He's a consultant to everybody from Scotland Yard to the FBI to lots of law enforcement agencies. I don't know that there's a smarter person in the world on the subject of murder than Richard Walter. So I contacted him, told him that I needed some help, just asked if he would consider it. And he absolutely offered to look at the files. And the very first conversation I had with Richard Walter, I'll never forget. He asked me a series of questions. I answered those, and then he finally said, I can go ahead and tell you it's very likely that Paula Herring was murdered because of what she knew and what she knew about some of the people that were involved. Paula Herring wasn't murdered by the Creve Hall prowler. She was never raped. There was no sexual assault. John Randolph Clark ended up being charged initially with sexual assault and with first-degree murder. But eventually, right before the trial, the DA's office actually backed away from the sexual assault part, and they said, you're right, that didn't happen. But Richard Walter figured it out pretty quickly.
What she knew, and in the story I did, and in the book, there's the picture that had not been published in the newspapers of the mayor's mistress at the time,
yes.
Beverly Briley's mistress. She was the first person talked to.
Correct.
And the alibi then for releasing her came, you're saying, from the mayor.
That's correct.
And now, so get into all that, because now we're getting at it right there.
So on the night of the murder, I think I maybe described this already. Within the first 24 hours, there were, again, the Central State mental patient that was picked up, 2 Vanderbilt students, a bloody man at the Crystal Hamburger place they couldn't identify, and eventually John Randolph Clark. But what also happened, sometime after midnight on the Saturday night when Paula Herring was murdered, the detectives figured out pretty quickly who the best suspect was in the crime. They put that woman, a nurse, in their squad car. They brought her downtown Nashville to, I would call it the police station. I think back then it was actually called the Municipal Public Safety Building. They brought this woman in, and they kept her from midnight until daybreak, interrogating her. But this woman was part of this drinking club. And so she played the get out of jail card that she had. She turned out to be Mayor Briley's mistress. And so Briley ended up in my estimation, providing the necessary information to cover for this woman. And this nurse walked away, even though she was the first suspect, even though none of this was ever brought forward in any newspaper, either the Tennessean, not in the Nashville Banner, not on any television station at the time. But 24 hours later, when they brought in John Randolph Clark, he was brought in, kept all night. That made every newspaper, every TV station, complete coverage front to back. So the first suspect in this murder, actually no one knew about until I came along and found the information.
First, and there she is, the first and best suspect is what you're saying.
Yes.
And what do you think the police chief thought of that?
I think Chief Kemp, from all appearances, was an honorable man, and he had, I think, a pretty good idea of who was involved in the murder. But to be able to move forward with that, I mean, just as an aside, you and I can be arrested tonight, but unless the district attorney's office does something about it, we'll eventually just walk away. So I think Kemp had a really good idea of where he needed to go to pursue this, but with Briley's help, the first suspect, the nurse, walked away. Before they had to come back to her, they actually had John Randolph Clark. And Clark actually had some things in his recent history that made him a suspect in a different type of way. He could have been charged with a different crime. And so I think Clark ends up being their best choice, and that's who they went with.
Do you think that file that you found that led you on this journey was put there? You think the police chief in some way wanted people to find that file later down the road?
I'm wondering. It's hard to know. Chief Kemp was dead before I ever stumbled upon the file, but I have to believe there was some reason he kept it, and there was a reason it ended up in his effects, and they made their way over to the Metro Archives. Some people say you pick the story, and sometimes the story picks you. So I've wondered about that.
Let's go to Lucy. Hello, Lucy.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Well, I think the story picks you, sir. I've got your book. I picked it up when I caught part of the Mr. Hall's broadcast that night. And it seems like somebody has checked out some of the people and some of the places you've checked out in your books for other things. So, you know, you were talking about how they said Nashville used to be a real corrupt city back then. And it's changed. I really don't think it's changed too much. On the surface, it looks like it has, because I think the keepers of the stories are still watching, and I think I know somebody that knew a couple of nurses that worked at Vanderbilt at that time, and they kind of took off about that time. Nobody could stand to work at Vanderbilt, from what I understand, that was a nurse, because there were some things going on. I've been to what you would call dive bars nowadays, where Mayor Briley and his crew used to drink and party. And I helped save Beverly Briley's life one morning around 5 o'clock. We got him out of his car. He would have froze to death if he would have stayed in there. And I'll say this about Briley: he was a very intelligent man. He was very capable. You never could tell when he was drinking, but I really think that something picked him up off his feet, and that was just the way the Nashville machine was. I can't put it any other way. I want to know if you're going to have a book signing or anything. I would like you to autograph my book. I would just like to talk to you personally, but I don't want to drop a bombshell or people to rain down on me or Mr. Hall's show or anything else.
All right, well, let's talk about when you kind of where the book was reviewed by the Washington Post.
Correct.
So it's gotten national attention. This isn't
Correct.
just some local book. It's been reviewed by the Washington Post. It's for sale all over the country.
Correct.
And what have you been doing here in Nashville and just since the book came out?
So the book came out on September the 5th. So that's the day after Labor Day Monday. And my plan, I'll just tell you straight up, my plan all along wasn't to be an author. I actually went at this to solve a couple of puzzles. I was working on the Paula Herring puzzle, but also working on that missing 18-year-old aunt of my own. So I figured out the answers to both puzzles. But once I realized, I guess due to some of the political things, the only way to get this story out was to write the book. So I wrote the book, but when I did, I thought the first place I want to go back to would be Jackson, Tennessee. So on September 5th, the day the book came out, the Tuesday after Labor Day, I was in Jackson, Tennessee, the Jackson Sun, the newspaper, front page of the newspaper, all about the Paula Herring story. And I wanted to do that because that was the group of people who convicted John Randolph Clark without all of the information. Lucy, thank you for your comments. I appreciate those. I have a Facebook page, or actually the book has a Facebook page. You can, if you take a look at that, you'll be able to find out where I am signings, and I do several of those. I speak with book clubs frequently as well. As far as Mayor Beverly Briley, everything I've ever learned about Briley was he was very intelligent. My understanding, he graduated high school at age 16. By the time he was 18 years old, he already had his law degree from, I think it's Cumberland Law School out in Lebanon. He was maybe the youngest person to pass the bar in Tennessee. So I mean, a brilliant mind, a visionary, but apparently had some personal problems that caused him a lot of trouble.
And there's nothing in the book saying he did it or was there. It's more he's offering cover for a suspect, for the person you think did it, the mistress.
Exactly.
He's offering cover for her because she's part of this club.
And I think, I mean, in hindsight, I don't think he really could have done anything else. Because back in, what is this, 1964, no one was writing about John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his personal life. That didn't happen until years later. No one's writing about Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal life. That didn't happen until years later. And no one was writing about Beverly Briley's life as well. So he was between, I guess you'd say, the rock and the hard place. So he had to provide cover.
We're going to take a break. Then I want to talk about what sort of pushback have you gotten since this came out from whomever.
Okay.
We'll take a break. Be back right after this.